All right, so that, of course, is our amazing intro. Welcome to the Power Hour from the Representation Project. I am delighted to be featuring with Karen Crouse along with Sydney Corey, my co-host, who I will throw this over to in a moment. But I wanted to show you this fantastic headshot of Karen, an international sports correspondent for the New York Times. My name is Dr. Caroline Heldman, and I am the Executive Director of the Representation Project. And as I mentioned, I am joined by my fantastic co-host, Sydney Corey. Let me tell you a little bit about Sydney. She is a film professional with experience working in organizations including the Representation Project, Film Independent, and A24. She is currently working in documentary development at Concordia's studio, and she's going to take it away.
Hi, everyone. So basically, I'm just going to give you a little overview of the Power Hour if you don't already know. So the Power Hour is a monthly interview series that features extraordinary, influential change makers. And the purpose of this series is to bring the wisdom of activists and thought leaders to inspire you to take action. So I'm just going to introduce Karen, tell you a little bit about her amazing background. So, hi, Karen. Karen received a BA in journalism and physical education from the University of Southern California. She earned a varsity letter in swimming while at USC. And Karen began her career at Swimming World and later worked at the Savannah News Press, where she was the first woman in its sports department. She was on the staff of 6 other papers, including as sports columnist at the Los Angeles Daily News and the Palm Beach Post before joining the New York Times in 2005 as a sports reporter. Karen has been named among the top 10 beat reporters in the US by the Associated Press Sports Editors Association. She was also a finalist at the NSMA Awards in 2016 for National Sports Writer of the Year. And in 2018, Karen authored Norwich, published by Simon & Schuster, and Karen was named International Sports Correspondent for the Times in October 2018. Thank you so much for being here, Karen.
Thank you. I'm so humbled. I never consider myself extraordinary or necessarily influential, but I'm happy to talk with you.
No, for sure. It's funny. My little sister, she's 18 and kind of sidetrack, wants to go into journalism. So it's so inspiring to see women kind of in that field.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So question for you. How did you decide to become a sports journalist? I understand that you had a really unique childhood experience that set you on that path.
I have the most amazing origin story, and I tell it knowing that I had nothing to do with it. It spoke to the generosity of spirit of all the people in my life. I can take no credit for the amazingness of this story, but I was in 8th grade. I grew up in Santa Clara, which was a hotbed of swimming at the time, really aspired to be an Olympian one day. There was a swimmer on our team. It was De Anza Swim Club named Mike Bruner. He was the Michael Phelps of his day. He was an IMer, a butterflyer, a freestyler. He was supposed to make the Olympic team in multiple events. So he was a big deal, in other words. So I got assigned by my 8th grade English teacher to create your own magazine. I was so excited about this because I loved to write even back then. And I came home from school and told my parents about the assignment, the project, and I already had a name for the magazine. It was going to be called Swim Magazine. And my dad said, "Great, but who are you going to interview for your cover feature?" And I had never thought of gotten that far. And I was super shy. I can't even really overstate how timid and shy I was as at this time. Still am a bit of an introvert, but was really introverted then. And I said, "Oh, I'm going to just make up an interview." I could not even fathom actually having to talk to someone. And my dad said, "Oh no, you're not going to make up an interview. You're going to interview Mike Bruner." And you have to understand, for a 13-year-old on this team, Mike was God. I mean, the idea that I was going to approach Mike Bruner, you might as well be telling me I was going to fly to the moon. But my dad took me to work out that day and basically, you know, pushed me toward the head coach of the team, a wonderful man named Bill Rose, and said, tell Coach Rose what your assignment is. So I told Coach Rose I had this magazine assignment and I wanted to interview Mike Bruner. And of course, the whole time I'm hoping, please say no, because then I can go back to plan A, which is fake news, right? I was decades ahead of the curve. And instead, Coach Rose listened to my, predicament and said, okay, Karen, you come with questions tomorrow and I'll make sure that Mike talks to you. So I found this out years later. What Coach Rose said to Mike that night was, you need to stay after practice tomorrow because you have an interview. So Mike, not unreasonably, thought, oh, great, someone from the San Jose Mercury or the San Francisco Chronicle or Sports Illustrated is going to talk to me finally. So you can imagine what he must have thought when the next day he comes out after getting changed, and there in front of him is this pigtailed little girl shaking in her shoes, holding 3x5 index cards with questions written on them. That was me. But instead of, he was as kind as he could be. If he was surprised to see who the interviewer was, he acted like it was completely normal and I was a professional, and he was very pleasant, answered all my questions. So fast forward, I finished the magazine, I get an A on it. The Olympic trials were shortly thereafter, and they were being held in Long Beach, which was just a short plane ride. And my dad said, hey, I'm going to take you there for your 8th grade graduation gift, and you'll get to see, the best swimmers in the country compete. So we arrive at the Olympic trials, and I have copies of Splash magazine, one to give to Coach Rose and one to give to Mike, because my dad said you need to give them proof of the work that they put in to help you do this, so that they can see the proof of the time they put in for you. Unbeknownst to me, Mike was in a terrible frame of mind. He had swum the 400 free before I arrived. One of the events he was supposed to make the team in had not made the team. He had swum the 200 free, had not made the team as an individual, but had made it in a relay. So he knew he was going to the Montreal Olympics, but only so far as a relay member, was basically guaranteed a gold medal. And his state of mind was such, he had sort of talked himself into, well, at least I'm going to get one gold medal. That's fine. So absolutely, expectations lowered, not in a good frame of mind. I show up on the deck with my Splash magazine copies, and I said, look at Coach Rose, I got an A. So there's not a coach I've covered in the 40 years I've been in this business that would have done what Coach Rose did next. He took the time in the middle of this very important meet to read the Q&A that I had done with Mike. And one of the questions I had asked Mike was, what do you do when you get to a big meet and you don't feel that good in the water? How do you still go fast? And Mike had said, well, it doesn't matter how you feel. I trust that I've worked harder than anyone else, and I trust that the hard work will pay off. So it really doesn't matter how I feel. I know I'm still going to go fast. So when Coach Rose got to that part, he goes, oh my gosh, Karen, this is fantastic. I'm going to show this to Mike right away. And indeed, he took off. So I have no idea what's going on. What I found out later, much later, was that Coach Rose took this Q&A, found Mike, who was getting ready for his best event, the 200 fly, and said, I want you to read this answer aloud. And he made him read it not once, but multiple times. So Mike goes out, he makes the Olympic team in the 200 fly, he wins. So no one would have been any the wiser about what role this little interview had had, except for afterward, a reporter from the Long Beach Press-Telegram asked Mike, your meet got off to kind of a rocky start. How did you turn it around tonight? And Mike, bless him, said, well, there's this little girl on my swim team, and she did an interview with me, and my coach had me read the interview, and it put me in a positive frame of mind. And that's why I was able to go out and do what I did tonight. So again, if that doesn't make it in the paper, my life goes on the way it always was. But that quote made it into the story. So the next day I arrive on deck, and the other swimmers are so excited. They said, Karen, did you see you're in the newspaper? So my dad went out and bought every Long Beach Press telegram within miles of the swimming pool and brought them back. And we read the story aloud, and we got to that quote. And I was blown away because, Sydney, I just can't express how shy I was. The idea that with words that I had written, I could positively impact the swimmer who we all saw as a god on our team. It was unfathomable to me. And so I told my dad, this is so cool. This is what I want to do. I want to grow up and tell people's stories and positively impact their lives. So Mike goes on to Montreal. He wins the 200 fly. He becomes the first gold medalist for the American team in Montreal, gets a call from President Ford. He returns to the US, goes to Stanford. I go to high school. I never see him, talk to him again. Decades pass. I join the New York Times, and I do a story, and I get a reader email, and it begins, you probably don't remember me, but you must be the Karen Crouse from De Anza Swim Club. This is Mike Bruner. And I just want to tell you that whenever I'm asked to speak about my Olympic experience, I talk about your magazine and how your interview helped my dreams come true. And I'm so happy to see that you've made your dreams come true too. So it was incredibly sweet, and it made me cry. So I emailed him back and said, you know, do I remember you? For better or worse, you put me on this path to where I am today. And so a couple more years passed. I ended up writing this story for the newspaper after sort of casually mentioning it to our Olympic editor, explaining why I love the Olympic swim trials so much. So after the story ran, I received another reader email from the person who had been my best friend in middle school. And she said, Karen, I read your Mike Bruner story with some interest. It was great, but I just feel like I need to remind you that that was an extra credit assignment. I remember you were totally into it, but you didn't even have to do it. And really, I honestly didn't. I was such a good student. The last thing I needed was extra credit. I had completely forgotten that piece of it. So I read the email to my husband, who thankfully had not known me at this stage in my squirrely stage of life. And he said, wow, Karen, that explains so much. So my life completely turned on an extra credit assignment. So I don't know what lesson is to be taken from that other than always go the extra mile.
Karen, your story speaks so elegantly to this idea of words having power, right?
And paying it forward too, like, just the generosity of my dad sort of pushing me out of my comfort zone, and Coach Rose not outright dismissing the idea of this pipsqueak interviewing his star swimmer, and then Mike being generous at his moment of triumph of giving credit, of giving credit to someone else. And there were just so many steps along this amazing story where someone went above and beyond to change my life.
Well, Karen, in 2012, you went above and beyond at Augusta National. Can you tell us about that process and how Dr. Condoleezza Rice becomes one of the first women to get access to that golf course?
Right. So in 2012, I'm covering the Masters, not for the first time. I had covered it a handful of times before, but I'm covering it for the first time as a New York Times reporter. And that was the year that Virginia Romney was elevated to CEO of IBM. She was the first woman in that position in historically, the CEOs of IBM and other sponsors of the Masters would be given honorary memberships to Augusta National. But Augusta National to this point did not have any women members. And even though this would have been a completely organic way to rectify that, okay, this woman has done all the heavy lifting to become the head of this company. We've given her predecessors an honorary membership. Let's just give her a membership. Boom, we've settled the issue of this private membership that to this point is male only. Well, they're a very stubborn club and refused to do this. This had been something brewing for over a decade. And for me, it just felt like, now you're being ridiculous. You had a chance to organically rectify this problem. The fact that you aren't, now you're just being vindictive and spiteful, and you're being true misogynist. So as a woman, it really hit me, because I felt like by covering the event and having this credential, if I didn't speak up and say something, it was almost like I was showing tacit approval of the status quo, which I absolutely disagreed with. So I wrote, it was a little bit complicated. All these years later, the lines have become blurred enough that the idea that you would be an advocate journalist and that was bad doesn't seem so horrifying anymore. But back in 2012, I was there to objectively cover the tournament, but I was also writing opinion pieces for the newspaper. So I wrote an opinion piece about what I thought of this, and just made it clear without being blunt that, it's just silly to me and amazing that they can get a restroom completely redone after lightning strikes it and ruins it, but they can't rectify this single error. Like, they can rally behind something when it suits them, but they can't affect change when it's right there to be done. And so the day that opinion piece ran, someone from Sports Illustrated came up to me and said, "I really enjoyed your piece on Augusta. You were spot on." And I said, "Well, exactly what I just said to you, that I told this person, it just really does feel as a woman that if I don't speak up, it's almost showing tacit approval for the status quo." And unbeknownst to me, the editor of the SI website was eavesdropping on the conversation. So he came up to me and said, "We're putting together a blog of voices. We've already talked to President Obama, and he said that Augusta National should invite women members. We were wondering, could we add your voice?" And at this point, I really, in retrospect, should have said, "Well, I've given my piece for the newspaper. What I said stands." But I did call my golf editor and said, "I've been asked to do this. Can I?" And the golf editor said, "Well, as long as you make clear that you don't decide what you get to cover, you don't have that authority." And I said, "Okay, fair enough." So I did sit down with the SI reporter and just basically told him what I had said earlier. Right on deadline, as I was writing off the first round of the tournament, the blog post hits. It doesn't have Obama's voice. It just has my voice. And the headline is "NYT reporter to boycott Masters." So things were taken a little out of context, but what could I do? I can't claim to be misquoted. I'm a member of the Fourth Estate. So it was rather difficult, to say the least. And so obviously this must have been a slow news week, because AP, which had a woman sports editor at the time, puts one of her reporters that's at the Masters ostensibly to cover the competition on this story. And he telephones my sports editor at the time, Joe Sexton, who, by the way, had put me on this beat with the express intent to shake things up, because I was the first golf writer the paper had who did not play golf and who was not a white male. Or I'm sorry, we did have we had two African-American men cover the beat, but they were all golfers. I was not a golfer. So I was put on the beat to look at it from a different perspective, but this was maybe a little bit too much of a different perspective for my sports editor, who told the AP writer that I had, I forget, I wish I'm just blanking. He basically said that I had spoken out of turn and I have been spoken to. And it was that I have been spoken to that once it appeared in print really seemed to spark a reaction, because it made it sound like I was 8 years old and, being taken to task. It was really hard to read that quote. And it was funny because I had been inundated with emails when the blog post came out, and all of them were like, oh, don't you get what a private club is? Don't you understand, lady? Why don't you go back to the food section where you belong? And, just for our listeners, I understand what a private club is, but when the private club is hosting the most prominent public golf event in the world, arguably, I think you give up some of the, perks of being a private club. You're opening your doors to the world for 1 week a year. You can't be completely private the other 51 weeks, if that's the case. So anyway, as soon as the sports editor's words hit the wire, and people started reading it, the conversation or tone of my emails changed completely from like, you're an idiot, to, wow, you think Augusta National is sexist? Look at your sports section and what you're dealing with. So I guess if anything, people became a little more sympathetic, but I was horrified and embarrassed. And again, I'm an introvert at heart, and to be the center of this news storm was just super uncomfortable. And yet I'm having to concentrate on my job. And I remember my sports editor saying, well, you're going to cover the rest of this tournament, and people better not be able to tell that how you feel about this club, and then we're going to be talking afterward. And it got back to me that other writers at the event were saying that I was going to get fired. It was awful. And because Augusta National has so many powerful members, nobody wanted to be seen talking to me, because they didn't want to get lumped in with me, because clearly I was going to be a pariah and probably not ever get invited back to the tournament. So I basically went for 3 days without anyone talking to me. There was one wonderful Augusta National member, Rob Johnston, who came up to me the Saturday of the tournament. I think he could read the situation and saw how I was being castigated and ostracized. And he said, Karen, I just wanted to introduce myself. I don't think we've met. I'm Rob Johnston. And I have since, at every opportunity, let him know how much that simple gesture meant to me, because I was really feeling under siege. But there's always a silver lining, and that Sunday of the Masters was Easter. So I phoned my mother to wish her a happy Easter. And she said, Karen, I understand like there's some controversy this year at Augusta about women members. Have you written anything on that? And I thought, oh my goodness, just such a great lesson that when you're in the middle of something, you feel as if the whole world is, following your distress. And here, the bubble in which I was existing did not even extend to my own family members. So it was just a reminder that this thing in the grand scheme of things is not as big as it feels to me, and it too shall pass. But it was super uncomfortable. The great postscript to that, and Carolyn, I think you know this, is that I ended up talking to I was summoned to New York. Jill Abramson was the executive editor at the time. I was summoned to her office and told what I did wrong. And I felt really on unsettled ground there. It was really a difficult situation to go through. So I got a job offer. They came to me. I didn't apply for the job. I wasn't even necessarily aware that there was an opening, but the San Francisco Chronicle had an opening for a sports columnist, and the sports editor reached out to me. And I remember asking him, like, well, why are you talking to me? Like, why do you see me as a candidate? And he said, well, we know you're from the Bay Area, but man, we so admire the stance you took at Augusta. And it was like, oh, okay, so I'm not a pariah everywhere, just in my little circle I am. So I ended up getting offered that job, and it was right before the London Olympics. And so I asked him, can I wait till I get back from the Olympics? And he said, oh, sure. The job is yours if you want it, just let us know. So I remember my husband saying to me, don't fret this, Karen, you'll get a sign whether you should take this job or not during the Olympics. Well, of course I got no sign during the Olympics. So I get home and I'm still really struggling with what to do. I decide to take the job. So I write a letter of resignation, and I call the sports editor, Joe Sexton, and I tell him I need to fly to New York to see you. Can we meet outside the newspaper? So I fly to LaGuardia, I land, I'm in a cab on the way to the Times to give my letter of resignation to Joe Sexton. My phone rings and the golf editor said, did you hear the news? And I said, no, I'm in a cab on my way to the office. What's going on? The golf editor said, Augusta National has just released a statement announcing that it has offered membership to 2 women, of which Condoleezza Rice was one. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was so surprised, because we had always thought that when and if Augusta National decided to offer membership to women, they would do it so quietly. They would not make a big deal of it. So we would only know when we attended that year's event and a woman wearing a green jacket, the sign of membership, showed up. I mean, we never thought that they would make a big deal of it. And here they were on a quiet day in August, a day that if they had done it a day later, I would no longer be at the New York Times. I mean, the timing was so unbelievable. All I could do was take it as the sign I needed. So I phoned my husband and I said, remember that sign that you said that I would get when I was trying to figure out what to do here? I think I just got it. And I explained to him what happened. And I ended up not speaking with the sports editor that day because I had to write the A1 story about Augusta National offering membership to women. And I remember calling the San Francisco Chronicle editor back that night, and he had even reached out to me in an email and said, wow, you should feel so proud that you had some role to do in the news today. And I told him, you know, I don't know if that's true, but I feel as if the Times does offer me that platform. And so I feel like I need to stay at the paper and utilize it to the best of my ability. But it is very crazy the way the world works, but good on them for finally doing the right thing.
Woohoo. Yes, the power of your words.
Yes.
It's so funny, but because I never, you know, the circles in which I move, that was not seen as a positive. I mean, as you can hear from my story, I was not getting attagirls at all. I was hearing that I'm going to be fired, that what I did was terrible, that I was outside, you know, I was working outside of the lines. I did not have the authority to speak that way. So I was just processing it as if what I did was so bad that it was a negative. And then I remember getting asked to speak at a conference that Carolyn was at, and having these people come up to me, including Carolyn, and say, that was so great what you did. And was so emotional for me because it was honestly the first time that I had ever been told that that was a good thing, this what I had done. Like going out on a limb wasn't bad, it wasn't wrong, that it actually had that I had done something worthy, because I was not hearing that side of it at all, from the golfing world or from the place of my employment.
Wow. That's actually a perfect segue into my next question for you, Karen. So, as a woman sports journalist, you are a rarity. There's only 11%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Only 11% of sports writers in the US are women. And you've kind of touched a bit on your experiences in this male dominated profession. Can you speak a bit more directly to that?
Yeah.
Have you experienced and witnessed things in sports journalism that really reflected kind of the sexism in that field?
So, Sydney, I'm so glad you asked that question. And I'm a bit embarrassed to say that it's only been relatively recently that I've started processing a lot of the microaggressions that I think exist that are gender related in sports journalism and sports coverage. And I'm going to give you two recent examples, both involving the world of women's golf. I'm sorry, women's golf and women's tennis. So I was at the Australian Open this year when Naomi Osaka won the women's title. And on her way to the title, she beat Serena Williams in the semifinals. And when I worked at the Palm Beach Post, I covered tennis, and Serena and Venus were locals for me. They lived in our coverage area, and I have always admired Serena from when she wore the cat suit at the US Open. I just feel like she has always modeled a strong woman who is not afraid to be herself and be different. But I could never understand why she was the object of so much criticism. I remember even when she wore the cat suit at the US Open in the early 2000s, and people describing it as disgusting and inappropriate. And I thought, man, do you know how much courage it takes as a woman who does not fit that, strict, very waspish model of beauty, to show her curves? I mean, I thought she was a rock star for doing that. And I couldn't understand this perspective that was criticizing her. And then it's only been some things that have happened recently that I've realized, oh, because this story was being told predominantly from a white man's perspective. This is why diversity in coverage matters. So fast forward to the Australia Open this year. So Serena loses this, match to Naomi. And I think for Serena, it was really heartbreaking because she didn't play poorly. It was almost like she was beaten by a younger version of herself. So if I'm playing armchair psychologist and I'm putting myself in Serena's head, I'm thinking like, wow, my road to equaling Margaret Court's major title record is really becoming steeper and steeper, because now I'm going up against people who are playing like the younger me. I'm having to beat the younger version of myself. I mean, this is how I've elevated to the game, to the extent that it's now working against me in my twilight years. So afterward, there weren't very many of us in the interview room because of COVID restrictions and protocol. And Serena had taken a very long time afterwards. She had waved to the crowd, and it almost felt like a farewell. And so she answered a few questions, and then I said to her, Serena, it seemed as if you were sort of you were just taking your time saying goodbye. It almost felt like it was a goodbye, that wave to the crowd at the end. Was this your farewell to the Australian Open? And she had been really emotional the whole time, but she answered the question, said something like, well, even if it was, I'm not going to tell you guys. She managed to kind of get through it. But then the next question, a man asked her, like, oh, so all those unforced errors you had, was that you, or was that Naomi forcing that on you? Well, she started crying, got up, the interview is ended. So I received some emails from all women. These emails came from saying, wow, that was, you asked that question as well as it could have been asked, but I think that was really the question that made Serena emotional and led to the crying that ended the interview. So don't feel bad about that. Your question was fine, Well, the men in the interview room interpreted the situation entirely differently. The next day, the man who had asked the final question came up to me and said, well, you just can't imagine. I'm hearing from people I haven't heard from for decades about, oh, I saw you made Serena cry yesterday. And so then another writer, who I will not identify to protect the guilty, said, well, you were a hero in my household because we're not Serena fans. And at that moment, I had such clarity, like, wow. So there have been people covering Serena throughout her career who are very clear that they don't like her for whatever reason. Do you think they're really being objective in how they cover her? How are they keeping those biases out of their coverage? So, I mean, maybe the same thing can be asked of me. How was I able to write about the Masters when I clearly didn't agree with their membership situation? But it's one thing to write about the players who are competing in the Masters, and quite another thing to write about the membership of the Masters. They're almost two different things. So anyway, it made me think that Serena probably has not gotten a fair shake in how she's been covered over the years, because the people covering her have been largely white and male. I mean, if you look at a tennis news conference, it's not a very diverse group of reporters. Okay, so just last week, I was covering the Women's PGA Championship golf in Atlanta. And there was, again, a white man covering his very first women's golf major. And he sat there and was remarking on how slow the women play, and they're so slow, and why, why are they so slow? And someone needs to do something about the slow play. And it was unbelievable to me. There were two players who completely, they were playing so well. Nelly Korda, the eventual winner, and Lizette Salas, they had completely separated themselves from the rest of the field. They were the story. Nelly is a super fast player, so she's going to make anyone playing with her look as if they're playing slower. But besides which, that's not even the point. These two women were putting on a fantastic display of golf. And all this man can comment on is how slow the women are playing. And I finally had heard enough, and I spoke up in front of the entire, assembly of reporters in this room and said, I'm just curious, did you comment on how slow Phil Mickelson played the final two rounds of the PGA Championship when he won? At one point, he was a group and a half behind the group in front of him, or a hole and a half behind the group in front of him. Did you comment on that too? Are you commenting on the slow men? Why is this just an issue for the women? And I know I offended him, but too bad. Like, this is the first event, a first women's major he's covered, and this is the bone that he's going to chew. I just really, again, it was another reminder that, okay, he said, well, they're talking a lot about it on Twitter. Okay, you know who they is? Basically, white men on Twitter are talking about it. So this white man picks up the cause and beats this drum, which I'm the first to call out, you know, slow play when I think it's germane to the story. But on this weekend, when Lizette and Nellie were distinguishing themselves, playing this course that had hosted many men's majors and playing wonderfully, I just didn't think that was the story. And yet he was making it the story for whatever reason.
Karen, one last question for you before we jump into the audience questions. And folks in the audience, you should definitely put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I can actually read from both, as can Sydney. So pop your questions in there. Karen, last question. Great timing having you on the Power Hour this month because the Olympics are coming, and I know you're covering the Olympics. So tell us what we should be watching for.
Well, Simone Biles, I believe, is going to be the story of the Olympics throughout the world, not just in America. I think it's going to be all Simone all the time. And as it should be, she has taken a really terrible situation. I mean, I think we can all agree that USA Gymnastics has not had the gymnast's best interests at heart. And she was a survivor of Larry Nassar and has not only survived, but thrived. I mean, she's got, I think, at least 4 moves that are named after her because nobody else has done them. So I think she is far and away the story. For people looking for first, I'm cover swimming. The 1500 meters for women will be held for the first time because, you know, for so many decades, women were seen as delicate creatures who could not go 1500 meters without, you know, somehow endangering their reproductive systems. That's, honest to God, I'm not being flippant. That was the reason given for not having this distance at the Olympics. And then over the years, it just became, it's not in, so why put it in now? So I imagine that Katie Ledecky, who holds 16 of the top 20 all-time swims in the event, will become the Joan Benoit Samuelson of swimming. And just as Joan won the first women's marathon, I expect Katie to become the first 1500 gold medalist. Laurel Hubbard is a weightlifter for New Zealand, a transgender athlete who will be the first transgender athlete to compete. And it's been a very controversial situation. Even some of her competitors are, you know, have differing opinions about whether she belongs on that stage. So there's going to be no lack of storylines in Tokyo, and you'll be able to just watch it all on TV since there aren't going to be a lot of other ways to process or absorb or digest this Olympics, since there will be no fans from outside Japan allowed in.
Got it. Okay, so first question. Are there any alternative or underrated sports that aren't in the Olympics that should have more airtime in your opinion?
Well, there are 2 sports, climbing, I guess it's not mountain climbing, but climbing and skateboarding are making their Olympic debuts. So those will also, I think, draw a lot of interest. It's funny because I've covered swimming since I arrived at the paper at the New York Times. So I've done swimming for the New York Times in 2008 when Michael Phelps won his 8 golds. 2012, 2016, Michael was always the story in those games. And for the first time in my Times tenure, I am going to an Olympics without a Summer Olympics without the main story in my pocket. So I'm going to have to be finding interesting stories that can take eyeballs away from Simone Biles. But I'm sure there are many sports that surfing is also going to be in the Olympics. So these are sports that have been angling for Olympic inclusion. They finally are being included. I would like to see softball return to the Olympics. It was in the Olympics with baseball, got lumped in with baseball. The baseball players, the major leaguers, weren't overly embracing the Olympics because, of course, it's not the biggest achievement in their world. So for that and a few other reasons, baseball got dropped from the Olympics, and softball, which really needs to be in the Olympics, it grows the sport. Those women, it would be their their biggest platform. They also ended up collateral damage to that decision. So I would like to see softball back in the Olympic program regularly. It would help the sport worldwide for sure.
Another question from an attendee. What would be your dream topic to report on if you didn't have to worry about audience interest or other existing limitations?
Wow. Well, I never worry about audience reaction or feedback or interest, because I assume that if I'm interested in a topic or curious about something, that readers will be too. So that's not too much of a worry of mine. But I've always been interested in the mental health piece, dating back to when I was a swimmer at USC and saw that some of my most esteemed and decorated teammates, the world record holders, the Olympic gold medalists, they had some of the worst self-images. They had poor mental health. So I was on this mental health, bandwagon decades ago, and really have set out to humanize athletes so that they don't feel like they have to live up to these images that are unsustainable and which contributes to poor mental health. So I believe that if I could write about anything, I would really like to just deeply involve myself in the mental health realm, and what can we do to help these elite athletes. It's not as if I sadly believe that the mental health piece is sort of the kryptonite to their greatest strength becomes their greatest weakness, that many of the qualities they have, the perfectionism, I'm going to be tougher than my toughest moment, that attitude, that feeds into the poor mental health. So it's not as easy as saying, well, let's just give them a more holistic lifestyle and then that will take care of it. No, they're always going to reject that more holistic lifestyle. That's what makes them, the wiring that makes them who they are. So we have to find a way, as these alphabet organizations and coaches and parents, to make this a more healthful pursuit. That's why I love Simone Biles' story so much. She's talked very openly about, I've really rediscovered the joy of gymnastics, and how she did that was really leading a more normal life. I won't say completely normal, but by normal, I mean like having a margarita, going out to a Mexican restaurant and having a meal with friends and having a margarita, like doing these things, practicing self-care that reminded her that she is a person in and of the world and not just a performer.
Great. I mean, Naomi Osaka has really taken a stance on that as well, and gotten criticism from other athletes. Karen, I am in the chat and I've got a couple of comments and then a question. Somebody notes that Deb notes that for the first time for women, Olympic BMX competition this year, which is great. Dee asks, is media coverage of male and female sports equal during the Olympics? And I am happy to report that the Representation Project is working right now on a study. We are launching a campaign called Respect Her Game. And what we find is so far that media coverage is actually balanced in terms of the amount of coverage. But Karen, as you pointed out, the type of coverage, my goodness, the little girling, the focus on emotional aspects, the focus on dress and appearance, that the type of coverage that women athletes get versus men athletes is quite different.
Absolutely. And I was just telling this story the other day. I remember Serena was probably in her late 20s and she went out early in a major. If my memory serves, it was the US Open. And someone actually asked her, well, your dad wasn't here this week. Do you think that was a factor in your, not playing well tonight? And yeah, her dad had been her first coach or one of her, only coaches. But at this point, she's in her late 20s. She's very much taken ownership of her tennis. And the idea that because daddy wasn't in the stands watching that she folded is just so ridiculous. And it's really, frankly, insulting to Serena. And I just have never heard, I've never heard someone ask Andy Murray, who was coached at one time by his mother, your mom wasn't here. Was that a factor in your loss? And again, I'm not meaning to cast aspersions on the men who ask these questions, because I think that's how insidious this is that you don't even realize the questions you ask are gender biased. It's so much a fabric of our culture that people would be astonished if you called them out on it, because they just don't see it.
Another question from an attendee. Are there any myths about the Olympics that you wish people would unlearn?
Yes, thank you for that question. An Olympic gold medal does not put you on easy straight. You are not financially set for life if you win an Olympic gold medal. Even if you win 2 Olympic gold medals, you're not set for life. Very few Olympic medalists are able to monetize their success at an Olympics. The Michael Phelpses, the Katie Ledeckis, the Simone Bileses, they are the exception. And I cannot tell you how many athletes to this day I talk to who thought if they could just win an Olympic medal, be on the podium, they could win a gold medal, that their lives would be transformed. They would be happier. People would like them more. They would be more successful. That is the big lie. I mean, if anything, Michael Phelps going public with his mental health issues in the last few years has shown us that you can win 28 Olympic medals and it does not give you a happy life necessarily. In some ways, the success, because these Olympians, for the most part, operate under the radar for 3 years. They get 2 weeks in the limelight. There's such pressure to perform because this is the one time maybe in their entire careers that the world is watching. So if they do succeed, they do have these expectations that I'm going to arrive home and everything is going to be different. In many cases, not only do they arrive back to the same problems, issues, and challenges that they left with, but now their success has created new problems on top of their issues, which is what happened with Phelps, which exacerbates the many issues that they already have. So if I could just write one wrong that is associated with the Olympics, it's that the Olympic gold medalists, their financial futures are secured, that they're going to live happily ever after, because that just is not a given at all.
Karen, Veronica is asking about karate and Taekwondo. These sports are considered as demonstration sports, but not official.
Yes, I actually, when right before the pandemic struck, one of my first international sports assignments was I went to Paris for a big Taekwondo competition, one of the last that was determining the Olympic spots. And it was amazing. And, I was trying to get up to speed on everything I didn't know. I think it's great that it is in the Tokyo Olympics, where it is such a huge deal. And I hope it gets way more people interested in the sport, because it has something for all of us, competitors and non-competitors alike.
You're speaking my language, Karen, as a Taekwondoist.
I'm late to the party, Carolyn, but at least I got there.
I just wish it was an Olympic something, right? When I was competing, it was hadn't got there yet. It sounds like it's not quite there yet, but maybe it'll be catapulted forward with the Tokyo Olympics.
Well, I was talking to one of the American competitors, and her coach was someone who was the best in the world in 2008 when it was not an Olympic sport. So he was winning world titles. titles, but didn't have a chance to be on the stage. And what I love about the Olympics is it does bring in the casual fan. And that's what I feel as if the sports that have been added where the Olympic medal is not the be all and end all, like tennis, golf, baseball, where they do have majors and World Series and other things that they grow up thinking are more important. What they don't these athletes generally don't understand about the Olympics is that you're not, if you're following the World Series, chances are you like baseball. That's why you're interested in it. The Olympics is bringing you an audience of people who maybe don't know anything about your sport, but because they love the Olympics, whether it's because they love the nationalistic part of it or whatever the reason, you're being introduced to such a wide audience. And it's funny, the women golfers have almost unanimously supported their inclusion in the Olympics. And if they qualify for the Olympics, they're going. They get it. They know that they don't have the greatest platform. They suffer in coverage behind the men. So they see the value of the Olympics. This is a platform and a stage where we can get this attention and grow the game. The men, not so much. Again, this year we had 4 of the top 12 players opt out because, you know, the schedule is too difficult, or the reality is they have so much money they're playing for in the States, it's just not a priority for them. But what they don't understand is that when 3 Asian women won medals in golf in 2016, it caused an explosion. The bronze medalist was from China, and they have the statistics to show that golf has just taken off among young kids in China since she won that bronze medal. It's not a coincidence. So I think that's why the inclusion of these new sports matters. It really does.
Yeah, she can see it, she can be it. And I think
Yes.
Sydney's gonna wrap things up for us.
Yes, everyone. Karen, this was so amazing. Fantastic. A lot of really great Q&A questions from the audience. But before we go, where can people find you? What should they keep up with? Tell us.
Yes, so you can find the coverage of from our very fine Olympics team at www.nytimes.com. That's our website. You can follow me on Twitter. It's at KAYCEE, which is the spelling of my initials. And yeah, just please reach out. I'm always happy to hear feedback.
Thank you, Karen.
Karen.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone for attending the Power Hour. We'll see you next month.
Bye.
Bye.